The ZVE1 is one of the coolest little cameras that Sony makes on the market right now. It happens to be my favorite camera for content creation, especially when it comes to video, which makes sense because this camera is geared more towards vloggers and people who are doing more video-centric type things. Which begs the question, is the ZVE1 a good camera for photography? And the answer is yes, and also no. Let me explain with a classic Jim Halpert type of pros and cons list.
Let us.
Oh my God, are you gonna make another pro and con list?
Pro number one is that the ZVE1 has a full frame 12 megapixel sensor. If you were going to compare the megapixel count on paper between this camera at 12 megapixels to something like my A7 IV, which has 33, or some of the A7R lines have like 60 plus megapixels, then you would think, wow, 12 is really not that much, so it must not be that good. But one thing that people may not know is that having less megapixels is not necessarily a bad thing, especially when it comes to low light. Because a camera like this has less megapixels, it's actually going to give you less noise, less grain artifacts in your image whenever you're shooting in lower light situations. And having more megapixels can actually increase the amount of noise that you could find in your image when it comes to low light whenever you're cranking up your ISO. So 12 megapixels is not all that bad. And it kind of is bad in some situations, but we'll talk about that in a second. And I also just want to say that I love having a full frame sensor for photography because if I put a 50mm lens on a full frame body, then I'm getting 50 millimeters from the camera. If you had a camera with like an APS-C crop sensor on it, then this 50mm is no longer 50mm. It would actually be a 75mm equivalent. So having a full frame sensor just gives you everything that you're giving the camera instead of having to do the math and factor in 1.5 times versus whatever your focal length is. It's just a thing. I'm not very good at math, so I just like not having to second guess that. I just know whatever lens I put on the camera, it's giving me exactly that with a full frame sensor. Pro number two is that the ZVE1 is a compact and lightweight camera, which is great for photography. The ZVE1 is small, compact, it's easy to carry around, and it makes it super convenient for bringing with you on the go whenever you're shooting, when you're out and about. There's been a pretty big resurgence in smaller camera bodies that you can bring around with you to get casual photos, things like the Fuji X100 line of cameras. Before I bought the ZVE1, I was actually looking into those cameras, but when I considered what I would really need this for, the ZVE1 made more sense. Forget the fact that the ZVE1 blows those cameras away on the video side of things, but I also wanted something that was compact like those cameras that could take some pretty good photos. And one benefit that this camera does have over those cameras that I mentioned is that this is a interchangeable lens camera. So if I don't want a 50mm, I can get a different lens, chuck it on there, and I can always swap it out. Pro number three is fast and reliable autofocus. The ZVE1 has Sony's latest and greatest autofocusing technology, which gives you advanced real-time eye autofocus tracking. You can even do different types of subject tracking, whether it's a human, whether it's a bird, whether it's an animal. I think that they have boats, cars, and planes. Sony's autofocus is very sticky and reliable, so you could burst off a ton of photos and you could be pretty confident that you will not have many misses because they just rock at doing autofocus, especially when it comes to photography. Now, it's not all sunshine and rainbows. There are definitely a few cons with this camera when it comes to photography, so let's go ahead and start talking about those. The first con of using this camera for photos is the full frame 12 megapixel sensor. Although a 12 megapixel sensor is great for low light photography, it might be limiting for you if you need a lot of resolution for printing or if you're going to be doing some pretty intensive cropping in your images in post. Largely, I would say the images straight out of the camera with maybe minimal correction to cropping to straighten your angles looks totally fine, especially if you're posting it on social media. I don't really think you would know the difference just from like the eye test between 12 megapixels, 24, or even 33, maybe even above that. However, if you are cropping in, you will definitely start to see the quality decrease pretty quickly with the 12 megapixel image. So just keep in mind, this may not be the camera for taking photos for, let's say, your bucket shot. Con number two, this camera has no EVF. It has no electronic viewfinder on the camera. So if you want to look at your image, if you want to get your focus, if you want to check your exposure and everything, you have to use the flip out, the flip in, the flipping, LCD screen. This was something that I kind of complained about in my full review of this camera. If you want to check it out, it's up there. I personally would like to have a camera that has an EVF if I was going to be using this primarily for photos. Although this is a pretty good LCD screen as far as brightness and image quality goes, you will definitely find yourself in some situations where it's not quite bright enough, or you're going to be getting a glare on the back of your screen, and you just kind of wish you had an EVF so that we didn't have to deal with all that. And you may also be a person like me that is so conditioned to either check my images with an EVF or just to instinctively put a camera up to my face. I do that all the time with this camera, and I'm just putting my face up to nothing, and I'm just like getting all my face oils on the back of my LCD screen, and it gets disgusting and kind of like a honey baked ham. It's gross. Con number 3 is that there are very limited controls on this camera body. Now this makes sense because the primary audience, again, is people who do more vlogging, more video-centric type stuff. So because of that, the camera body is very, very stripped down. And this could definitely be a frustration for people who are more accustomed to cameras that have, you know, multiple dials for shutter speed, for aperture, for your ISO, things like exposure compensation. This doesn't have a joystick, so you can't really do the focusing point with a joystick sort of thing. You can use the touch screen to set your focus point, but it's just not quite the same as having that nice joystick. This camera just simply doesn't have a lot of the features that more photo-centric cameras do. Again, makes sense, this one's more for video. But if you are somebody who is used to that style of camera, then this could definitely slow down your workflow. And because you're working slower, you might potentially miss a few shots. So let's wrap this video up by giving you my final thoughts. If you're looking for a versatile camera that can do really good video and can also handle photography, as long as you don't need high resolution images, as long as you don't need all the fancy bells and whistles that come with most photocentric cameras, then I think that the ZVE1 is actually a really solid option. However, if photography is your primary focus and you need high resolution, you need all of the functionality that comes with more photocentric cameras, then this probably is not the one for you. And in that case, you might want to consider a camera that's more geared towards stills photography, like the A7 series, like the A7 IV, A7C Mark II, or even the A7R series, which is even more heavily focused on stills because it has a much higher megapixel count. So that's my thoughts on using the ZVE1 for photos. It's both yes and both no to me, but I'm curious to know what your opinion is on this camera, especially for stills. Let me know in the comments down below. And while you're down there, if you got some value out of this video, why don't you go ahead and add some value right back to it by hitting that like button, and also subscribe to this channel and join the pack. And if you want to learn more about the ZVE1 and why it's my favorite camera for content creation, you should check out this video up here, or you can check out one of these other videos that I got for you to check out. But until the next time, my name is Zach Sopak, and I will see you in the next video. Peace.